We ready? Let's do this. Welcome to episode 18 of Things Hidden. Things Hidden is an exploration of the intersection of faith and 6 factors that surround faith: religion, physics, evolution, consciousness, philosophy, and technological innovation. The purpose of Things Hidden is to bring people into a closer relationship with God, and through that process, coming into a closer relationship with God myself. Okay, here we are. But before we get started, smash that like and subscribe button. And if you're really feeling generous, do me a favor and leave a comment as well. It helps Things Hidden get out to more people. Today, we will be discussing near-death experiences, or NDEs. NDEs are the phenomena of common occurrences reportedly experienced by people that are close to clinical death or actually clinically dead. These NDEs are found to occur in 10 to 20% of cardiac arrest patients and approximately 15% of ICU patients. And today we're going to be doing a lot of jumping around in 2 different videos, a couple minutes here and a couple minutes there. And that way we can just cover as much as possible. We're going to be touching on a lot of different things as it relates to NDEs. We're going to be touching on research methodology. We're going to be touching on defining an NDE, the common elements of an NDE, common pushbacks against what NDEs are. We're going to be looking at the state of NDE research. We're going to be looking at NDEs versus hallucinations. We're going to be looking at NDEs versus psychedelic drugs. And then we're going to spend some time looking at the 2 strongest subcategories of NDEs, which are called veridical NDEs and peak in Darien NDEs, and a bunch more. So the study of NDEs really only began in earnest in 1975 with the publishing of Raymond Moody's book, Life After Life. This was the book that actually coined the term near-death experience. And at the time, the study of near-death experiences really was non-existent in any sort of like organized, acute form. And the stuff that was sort of like pseudo research that was going on at the time, it was considered, fringe, and it really wasn't being taken very seriously by mainstream science. But over the last 50 years, as a result of significant research, science's attitude towards NDEs, it's changed massively. And this is no longer a fringe area of science, and NDEs can no longer be hand-waved away by materialists. And while the exact cause of NDEs remains a topic of debate and exploration, the clinical research around these events has been beefed up considerably in the last few decades. And there are now multiple well-funded, serious, academic level institutions that are leading research in this area of NDEs. And those include places like the IANDS, the International Association for Near-Death Studies, the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies, or DOPS, and the NDERF, the Near-Death Experience Research Foundation. So NDEs are now a bona fide area of serious scientific research. We will be reviewing portions of 2 different videos today as part of this discussion of NDEs. And at this point, you can just type NDE into the YouTube search bar, and you're going to find hundreds of hours of discussion from leading experts in this field. There are entire channels dedicated to just this topic. And I've spent a good amount of time personally down these rabbit holes, and it has just been impactful for my own faith. And that is why I am sharing this topic with you here today. Okay. The first clip we will watch is just about 3 minutes long, and this is with Dr. Jeffrey Long. He is the founder of the NDERF that I just mentioned, and Dr. Long is one of the foremost authorities on NDEs. He has hours of NDE content on YouTube, and it's some of the best out there, in my opinion. And this first clip is just Dr. Long talking some about his background, and I just think it's worth listening to get a sense of the seriousness of his career, because I think that some people that maybe are not that familiar with NDEs, they may have this tendency to think that this sort of research is not being done by serious professionals, but that is not true. So, okay, here we go. Dr. Jeffrey Long.
What do you do today? What is your day job? I work full-time as a radiation oncology physician, serving actually an underserved area in Kentucky.
So you see cancer patients on the regular?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so how do you integrate your interest in near-death experiences with working with these cancer patients? Do you let them know about your interest in NDEs and ask them if they're willing to share their experiences, or how does that work?
Yeah. I'm very careful not to intrude my beliefs about near-death experience onto the patient. So I'm very easy to find on Google or YouTube or anywhere else. So if anybody looks me up, they immediately realize that this is something that I've talked about literally hundreds of times. So if the patient or their family member aware of that then wants to ask me about near-death experience or even share an experience that they had, well, certainly I'm very open to that and very delighted to spend the time talking with them as they share. And I've had quite a few patients or family members or friends with them share their near-death experiences. And that's just sort of a fascinating additional thing I do as a physician. And it certainly helps them to feel like here's a doctor or someone who's a very known near-death experience researcher validating my experience, talking about it. And I think it really helps them not only to better understand the near-death experience, but it helps create a stronger bond for me to work with them professionally in their battle with cancer.
And can you explain the competition that you were a part of with Bigelow?
Yes. Back in 2021, there was a billionaire by name of Robert Bigelow, and he had a huge contest where he was seeking an essay, 25,000 words, that had the best scientific evidence for survival of consciousness, or if you will, life after death. So over 1,000 people submitted essays because, well, the prize money was huge. And over 200 essays were selected for review by a very scholarly panel of judges. And so as a result of that, this is the 200 essays reviewed was some of the most stringent scholarly peer review imaginable for subject matter like that. And I was very honored to be in the runner-up group. I actually won $50,000.
Wow.
Well, I almost didn't, because I was going through my email one day and I saw the subject line, "You won $50,000. And I think most people would immediately click and delete it. But I went, wait a minute, what's going on? So I read it and oops, that's real. And so I was very honored to be a part of the group selected as having an essay about near-death experience. And by the way, that's the material we'll be talking about today. And then above and beyond that, there was another group from Europe that looked at all the essays that won prize money in this essay contest.
Yeah.
And I was honored to be one of the 6 that was selected as having the best scientific evidence for survival of consciousness in my near-death experience essay. So I want to emphasize, while what I'm talking about today may sound astonishing, please be aware that it has undergone perhaps the most stringent scholarly peer review imaginable. So this is the real thing.
Yeah, okay, so hopefully that just lends some credence to this guy's view. Next, we're going to jump into listening to him talk about some of the methodology used in NDE research. And the host here, Danny Jones, who I think is excellent in his role, he pushes back here in ways that I think are really helpful in just helping to frame the overall situation. And if you don't know Danny's channel, it's big, over 1 million subscribers, and he has a bunch of really interesting guests on. He likes a lot of the kind of fringe scientific type of stuff. I've listened to a fair amount of him. He's an excellent interviewer. Just to note, he does have, I would say, people on his channel sometimes that are way, way far away from the mainstream. That's not true in this case. This guy is, one of the foremost authorities on NDE research, which, like I said, is becoming increasingly, I would say, is a totally legit area of research now. But he has a cool channel, so if you haven't seen it, you should check out some of that stuff. But okay, let's jump into some of this methodology around NDE research.
What do you hope to find with all these near-death experiences and finding obviously they're looking for correlating experiences between all these near-death experiences, but do you have any idea of like what the ends to all this is?
Yeah, it's a good one. As first and foremost, I'm a scientist, so I don't go through my research with any preconceived agenda or preconceived notions about what the outcome will be. As a scientist, I'm always led by the evidence and the reasoning from that evidence, just like in my medical practice. So what I hope to find is the truth. I want to know about near-death experiences. I want to know, are we convinced based on evidence that consciousness can exist apart from physical brain function? If we're convinced that near-death experiences are real, which frankly I am based on my research, well then near-death experiences consistently talk about an afterlife, that being a realm of existence after our earthly life. So if you really understand that near-death experiences are, in a word, real, then that next question, very important question is, well, if it giving us some evidence about the afterlife, what is that evidence? How sure are we about that evidence? And that's where my research really gets exciting.
Well, the problem is it's all anecdotal, right? The problem is you can't actually study it. You can only get people's recount of a personal experience that they had.
Well, and the problem with doing near-death experience research is that if someone dies permanently and irreversible, Danny, they make horrible research subjects. Yes. They won't answer any dang questions at all. So you really have to go with what you have. And anecdotal implies a limited number of case reports. We're way off the scale on that. We have over 4,000. There's literally many, many thousands of more of near-death experiences that have been described by literally scores of other researchers. And it's a basic scientific principle that what is real is consistently observed. And we have that overwhelmingly in near-death experience, not only in my study group of 4,000, but as corroboration with the same things that people are observing other research data sets. So I think given that the best we can do with near-death experience research, when you see that kind of consistency across many different researchers, among the young, among the old, among people with widely varying prior religious or cultural beliefs, even not believing an afterlife was possible, by the time you see that very consistent content of a near-death experience, how they change after the near-death experience, and how they consistently point to some conscious existence of life after death, I think you have to believe that based on evidence.
Yeah,
anecdotal implies a limited number. That's just a great point. He has over 4,000 in his database, and then there are multiple other large independent databases that also corroborate the same findings that he has from his database. So this is just, like I said, this is a real area of study. Okay, next we're going to jump into shared NDEs. And that nomenclature does get a bit confusing. And so I'll come back and talk about just the what that word means, and it gets used in different ways sometimes. But so this is about shared NDEs here.
With you, I guess what I was getting at is all of these stories or people that you have submitted, the 4,000, I think you said, that have submitted their experiences, it's all subjective experience, right? None of it, it's impossible to have a secondhand account of somebody's near-death experience or corroborate somebody's near-death experience, right? I'm not to say that they're making it up. Like I totally believe it. And I don't think that you can rely on the scientific method for everything. I think, there's squishy science, right? There's obviously there's science out there that can't be measured and tested. That is absolutely real.
Well, let's actually, there is some line of evidence that indeed what is described in near-death experiences is likely that initial, or very probably, that initial sequence of events for those that die permanently and irreversibly. That line of evidence, which is yet another line of evidence for the reality of near-death experience, is called shared near-death experiences. We have about 20 people where there were 2 or more people that simultaneously had a life-threatening event. And they both had consciousness apart from the body. Most of the time in this series, they're able to see each other, communicate with each other, and often have dramatic discussions like, wow, there's our bodies down there, and here's our consciousness up above. So shared near-death experiences in my series of about 20 do exist. They're typical near-death experiences, but there's 2 people interacting that, while their physical body is unconscious or clinically dead below. In my series, virtually all of the cases, one of them goes on to have permanent irreversible death, and the other person recovers. And when they get over that close brush with death, they can share with the world that shared near-death experience.
Whoa.
I was excited to start getting a series of those too. So, that is probably the most direct observation that is possible of people who are ultimately going to permanently, irreversibly die, sharing and interacting with another person with their consciousness apart from the physical body, existing non-physically, if you will. And one person goes on and is permanently, irreversibly dead. Very dramatic accounts.
How do these people, can you walk me through how they describe these accounts?
Sure. One example I share a lot would be a gentleman who was driving his fiancée. They were in Canada. He was driving along and he fell asleep. And so the car crashed. And then both him and his fiancée, their consciousness rose above the crashed car. And they were met by 4 beings. And they felt overwhelming sense of love and compassion. So when these 2 beings flanked each of them, the group of 4 beings, they separated. They actually went up above their car, their fiancés, holding hands. So the beings they encountered with their consciousness far above the car gently separated their hands, and they felt so. The gentleman who survived said he felt so much peace and so much love that he wanted to resist, but really didn't. And they could see off in the distance a landscape, an unearthly realm, if you will. Some call it a heavenly realm, but they saw that over there. And 2 of the beings took his fiancée and very gently started moving her toward that distant realm, which is, I know full well from near-death experiences, that unearthly afterlife realm. And the other 2 beings gently led him back down to the car. So when his consciousness, physical consciousness, recovered in the car, the front of the car was on fire and his fiancée was leaning. And he instantly knew that that was, in his words, a shell, because she was dead, and he knew that instantly. And he'd left his fiancée with the other beings above.
Whoa. Are there any other accounts similar to this?
Yeah, we have quite a few.
So that are very similar with 2 people at the same time?
Yeah, we've had, just to, pull another one out of the series I have, there was, I think this was another car crash, and there were several youthful people, and the cars were crashed, and there were 2 basically friends, and they were up soar consciousness. Again, in near-death experiences, by far most common when that initial part of the experience, when consciousness goes apart from the physical body, it's up over the body. So here were the 2 of them above the crashed car, and they were looking down on their physical bodies down below and dialoguing, and kind of their reaction was, I think we're dead, because they could see plain as day that their bodies weren't moving.
But they were talking to each other?
Yeah, they're communicating about the fact that those were their bodies, the 2 of them down below the crash scene, and they appeared to be dead. And so they talked about that and had a dialogue. And then once again, that one of them went on and died permanent irreversible death. And when the other one recovered from what nearly killed him in the wreck, he was able once again to share those uncommon, but we have a small series now, a shared near-death experience. So,
are there any of these shared near-death experiences where both of them survived?
Now that's interesting. I haven't really found that, and I've looked. There was sort of a buzz about something that happened to a group of Arizona firefighters called the Hot Shots, but I haven't been able to corroborate that. And that was where 2 or more people survived and corroborated. But in the rest of the series we have, it's been one person. They were 2 people interacting. One went on permanent irreversible death, and the other person survived. We've had same thing. We've had building collapses, and we've had people, up above their body looking down, aware that they're down there and severely injured. But it's an absolutely fascinating study group of these shared near-death experiences.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this term shared near-death experience, or also sometimes called shared death experience, or SDEs. So this term is most often used to refer to situations where healthy living people experience something, that they deem supernatural, non-materialist, spiritual, whichever term you want to use, while witnessing the death of another. These are extremely common. Hospice nurses in particular just experience this constantly. You really can't find a hospice nurse that has not experienced a lot of this. And there are several hospice nurses that, did that role for a long time, experienced so much of this that then they went and wrote books about these shared death experiences, because they are just so common. So that is the most common thing that you see when people talk about SDEs or shared NDEs. But what Dr. Long is talking about here is something different. This is a situation where you have two people that are in a near-death experience, and one dies and one comes back. And then the person that comes back reports having a shared spiritual experience with the deceased. And Dr. Long has 20 of these in his database of over 4,000 NDEs. And, Danny did a great job of drilling down into the specifics of this, because what Dr. Long does not have, and I was also unable to find any instances of this. I went and did research to see if maybe something else had popped up since this interview or something like that. But there are not documented reports of two people having an NDE, both coming back, and then both reporting similar shared experiences, while unconscious. I wasn't able to find one of those, for what it's worth. And that was what he was referring to as well too. So, okay, this next clip breaks down some of the typical components of a near-death experience.
So the story that Jeff Kripal told me about Elizabeth Crone, lady who was struck by lightning in front of her synagogue, was so astonishing, because she described going to like a garden that she couldn't even translate into words. And she was having a conversation with like her grandfather or something. And she said it lasted for 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. And she was in this realm for 2 weeks, talking with people and having a conversation with her grandfather. And she describes at the end of it, there was like a light that came, and she made a conscious decision not to go to the light, but instead to go back to her body. Mm-hmm. Like she had a choice.
Yes. I know her well. I've talked with her directly, and believe me, that near-death experience was a real thing. Just to sort of take a look at some of the parts of what you just said there, it's astonishing to some people that you'd be in a near-death experience, a beautiful garden. Many people describe landscapes in their near-death experiences in these unearthly heavenly realms that have beauty beyond anything on earth. There may be colors beyond anything that they say could possibly have happened on earth, beauty that is indescribable. So it's not unusual that they literally don't have the words for what's literally an unearthly beauty and experience. Right. Encountered her deceased grandfather, very common. The overwhelming majority of, like in my study, 94% or more of beings encountered in these unearthly realms are deceased at the time of the experience. So that's not unusual either. And it astonishes a lot of people to, as you described, to talk with them for 2 weeks. And I need to explain that a little bit based on my study of near-death experiences.
Mm-hmm. Please.
Near-death experiences are a tremendously accelerated consciousness. The overwhelming majority of people having a near-death experience say that time is either radically different or simply doesn't exist. So in this non-physical, unearthly realm of the near-death experience, it's very hard to compare time there to time on Earth. But you can say, well, in the communication we had, it would have taken 2 weeks. So that's probably your best estimate.
Yes.
And you have to understand, too, that consciousness or the ability to process information, share, talk with deceased loved ones, or just experience this heavenly realm is something completely outside of earthly experience. For example, people may have during a near-death experience what we call a life review. They may see a part or even all of their prior life, often decades. A typical example is like it's flashing on multiple screens, but they're literally reliving, or if you will, at least being aware of all of their prior life while they're unconscious, typically around like minutes.
Yeah, so just a bunch of these typical components. You've got the heavenly realm, see that a lot. A lot of times you're seeing relatives, 94% of the people that are having an NDE encounter, 94% of them are dead. And then the life review, right? And this life review idea, this is one of the single most commonly reported aspects of an NDE. And so much so that, this phrase, life flashed before my eyes, this is just entered like mainstream everyday conversation. Right. And then the other thing that was just fascinating to me is when he was talking about time. Time is either radically different or doesn't exist at all during these experiences. And if you have been following along with Things Hidden, then you just know that time is a big one for us. We just did an entire episode on time essentially being a mirage. And so I can't help but listen to these NDE researchers talking about the warping or the dissolution of time that shows up in the majority of these NDEs. And I just find that really interesting. Okay. This next clip touches on the relationship between a person's religious beliefs going into an NDE and the NDE itself, which is definitely really interesting.
Do you see that? Do you see in people's recollection of their near-death experience, do you see any sort of correlation to their religious beliefs?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I've actually looked very carefully as other researchers. First of all, and I actually co-authored a scholarly book chapter on this, looking at all prior published literature some time ago. So first of all, looking at the big picture to address that important question, we can't really find any correlation with a person's pre-existing beliefs, religious beliefs, belief about life and death, and we can't find a correlation between that and whether the probability of them having a near-death experience or not at the time of a life-threatening event, or the content of near-death experiences. So looking at multiple prior published studies, there doesn't seem to be a real strong correlation. And yet, there are certainly people that do have near-death experiences where I think part of it is it's if you see like a white light, or you see the white light seems to have a consciousness, a presence. Well, somebody with a strong Jewish background may identify that as a prophet. As a Christian may say, oh, I recognize that, and connect the dots and say, maybe that's Jesus. So I think while the actual types of occurrences, the events, if you will, that occur in near-death experience are very consistent and consistently observed, I think there can be some overlap with their prior beliefs, especially religious beliefs. And I think just to take that and run, for instance, we have a series of people having a near-death experience in this unearthly realm where they may meet an amorphous, unformed being, light, energy, presence, and they may literally be asked, in what form would you like me to appear to you? So then they can decide and make a decision. So I think that's some of the complexity of near-death experiences. Is, when you have these events going on in a heavenly realm, it's not just your consciousness making it up. You are literally interacting with another very great consciousness. And so there can be components of the experience based on the other consciousness, which, thank goodness, is virtually always described as profoundly loving, caring, compassionate. And so I think that may be part of why the near-death experiences are so strikingly similar in content, and yet they can have regularly described that individual specific type of content. I think that explains that adequately.
It's like
Yeah, I just found that really interesting and honestly surprising. Just not really any detectable statistical correlation between with religious beliefs, basically. And he alluded to this, and I've listened to other experts talk about this. Other experts with different data sets also confirm the same thing. There's just not much correlation to religious beliefs, and that part just feels, I don't know, unignorable to me. And I'm honestly not entirely sure what to do with it. And then just the other part in that answer, which is just amazing, constant, very common to have these encounters with this, amorphous energy, I think was the term that he described. And then a whole series of people that say that energy says basically, what form do you want me to appear in? And I don't know, that's just crazy. That's just crazy, right? Like, and beautiful and powerful and, crazy in a really good way. And I thought that was beautiful, the way he described that of our consciousness. These are moments of interaction between our consciousness and a consciousness that is just much bigger than ours. And I just, just hits me right here. Okay, next clip, very interesting. This is a comparison of NDEs to psychedelic drugs like DMT and psilocybin. This part was particularly interesting to me because I feel like, at least like on YouTube and stuff like that, like the number one thing that people push back with from like a materialist skeptic perspective is that NDEs are caused by this big surge in naturally produced DMT from the brain. And you can find clips of people talking about people that have had an NDE and people that have also done DMT separately, saying that there are similarities between these two things. It's certainly the kind of thing that, can get a lot of views on a YouTube video or an Instagram reel or something like that. So Dr. Long just addresses this directly here.
There's people that talk about the similarities of a DMT experience to this near-death experience. There was one guy in a video that I watched yesterday who was basically playing it out. He said he had a near-death experience when he was a kid and he got in a car accident, and then he smoked DMT like 10 years later or something on a mountain. And he said he met the same exact entity and said, "You're not supposed to." He told him, he's like, "You're not supposed to be here." Mm-hmm. And have you ever experience or talk to people that have done both, smoked DMT and had an NDE?
We, in the survey of over 4,000 people, we have scores that had a near-death experience and also described using psychotropic drugs. I mean, you name it, I've heard it: DMT, psilocybin, LSD, etc. So yeah, we have a fairly good-sized series of those. I think when you look at comparing DMT or other psychotropic drugs to near-death experiences, you have to be aware that there's a bit of a bias in the sense that YouTube videos will become popular and you'll access them because they get a lot of clicks and they're interesting. Mm-hmm. And so that's interesting. They had a near-death experience and it was similar to DMT. However, in the hundreds, probably over 100 for sure, of people that have had near-death experiences and shared with our research website and then discussed and compared the use of psychotropic brain-acting drugs to their near-death experience, the substantial majority say that they were grossly dissimilar. They may be slightly similar in the sense that it was unworldly. They may have strong emotions associated with it. They may feel consciousness as a part, but the great majority, and again, that's all these are posted NDEs. Anyone on the world can look them up and see this. They're predominantly very, very different. Above and beyond that, I co-authored a scholarly paper, Dr. Parnia, and as part of that, we looked at near-death experiences and what occurred in near-death experiences, and that was virtually all derived from my nderf.org website, what occurs during experiences. And as part of that scholarly article published in the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences,
we had a group of the co-investigators look at all the scholarly literature on the effects of psychotropic drugs. So this was actually a scholarly review of published effects of both near-death experiences and psychotropic drugs. And once again, the conclusion of this published peer-reviewed paper was that they're substantially different. And if anyone has any doubt about that,
where can we find that paper?
It's at the Annals of the New York Academy of Science about 2 or 3 years ago.
Okay.
But what anyone can do is go to the website erowid.org, EROWID, which is by far the largest collection of first-person experiences with psychotropic drugs by the scores. I mean, there's some I hadn't even heard of. But if you go there and look up DMT or psilocybin or some of the more popularly named substances that purportedly mimic near-death experiences, all you have to do is go there and then look up hundreds of first-person experiences, do exactly what I've done. Go there, read 20 or 30 first-person accounts of psilocybin or DMT, and I think anybody can easily see quickly that the experiences are very different. These psychotropic drugs are far more likely to be hallucinatory. Events in these psychotropic drug experiences skip around like dreams, no surprise.
DMT is in the top left, Steve.
Yeah, and also, in addition to that, you may find that DMT or psilocybin are more likely to be frightening, and they're more likely to be recognized as hallucinatory, as opposed to near-death experiences where virtually all that have a near-death experience understand that it's real. So in spite of what you may see on YouTube or other media sites, this is the reality based on peer-reviewed public literature and actual first-person experiences posted on the website, and then coupled with people that actually have near-death experiences and hallucinatory experiences. But they're really different.
What is the idea? Before death, the pineal gland secretes DMT that basically allows that person to have a psychedelic experience that essentially allows them to die. Is that the theory of what the purpose of the pineal gland is?
I would, while that's a theory, I would have to say lots of people have had cardiac arrest, their heart stopped, and then they're resuscitated and they come back to life. I mean, thank goodness we have thousands, probably tens of thousands of people, even here in America, that have survived that horrific close brush with death. I would say almost uniformly, they don't come back and describe a hallucinatory experience associated with their heart stopping. So I think, while we still need to study the effects of the pineal or other brain chemistry mediators, there doesn't seem to be any resuscitation of these people that come back and describe something that would be a hallucinatory experience due to the pineal or anything else.
But
yeah, so I thought that's just a pretty good rebuttal, in my opinion, against this idea of DMT, this DMT flooding explanation. I thought it was a solid rebuttal against the idea that NDEs are hallucinations. And he kind of just gave you a few different perspectives, whether it's he said scores of people in his database that had an NDE and have also separately later on in their life had experiences with psychedelic drugs, or whether it's comparing all the people in this erowid.org, EROWID.org. This is this enormous database, and people just take drugs and then write about what it was like to be on the drugs. And so you can see all of these explanations of this is what it was like to be on DMT or this, that, and the other, and comparing those to his huge database of NDEs and how different they are. And then just lastly, the idea that if DMT, if there's a flooding of DMT at a near-death experience, then what about all the people that have cardiac arrests that make it, that don't die and come back from a cardiac arrest, and they don't at all like wake up and be like, oh man, I just had something that was a lot like a DMT trip. That's just not there at all. So, bunch of good stuff there, I thought. Okay. Let's see here. Couple more here. Actually, this will be the last clip from from Dr. Long here. And this is just a discussion where he's talking about some of the parameters around a bona fide NDE. And I think just also just gives us some insight into what his, professional stance towards this type of research is. So
People who their heart stops, they do have NDEs.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
When the heart stops, a cardiac arrest, that's one of the more common listed precipitating events of a near-death experience. Near-death experience, in my research, you have to be near death. In other words, so physically compromised that you're unconscious or clinically dead, like happens when your heart stops. So to understand how amazing it is that they have a near-death experience at that time, you have to understand the, if you will, the physiology of your heart stopping. Well, obviously, immediately when your heart stops, immediately blood stops flowing to the brain. 10 to 20 seconds after blood stops flowing to the brain, the EEG, electroencephalogram, which is a measure of brain cortical electrical activity, goes absolutely flat in the literature. So after 10 to 20 seconds after your heart stops, there's no measurable brain cortical activity, which is where your higher cognitive consciousness is. So it should be physically impossible to have a conscious experience at that time. And yet by the hundreds, people report near-death experiences after their heart stops, far beyond that 10 to 20 second interval, prior to anybody beginning CPR or efforts of resuscitation. So again, it's just yet another one of the stronger lines of evidence that after your heart stops and you have a near-death experience, absolutely medically inexplicable for that to be due to physical brain function.
How do we know that the brain stops 20 seconds after the heart stops? Like, how many people have we measured with an EEG on their head when their heart stops?
There's quite a bit of literature in the various medical journals. I've actually cited that these are big enough series that's generally accepted as being factual.
That just seems like a crazy thing to study, right?
Well, that's,
like, how would you be able to time that, to have an EEG on somebody and to be measuring their brain, knowing their heart's going to stop?
Well, it could be people, they're in the hospital, they're having some neurologic situation, they have an EEG on. Actually, interestingly, there was a very recent study by a Dr. Parnia called the AWARE-2 study, where they actually went out of their way to measure the EEG in people that, in a fairly good-sized series, that had a cardiac arrest. So that's by far the largest contemporary series of actual EEG measurements, and that was done prospectively. So that was published relatively recently, and they actually had targets placed, and they were hoping that people among these cardiac arrest patients would have a near-death experience and be able to spot a target with their consciousness apart from the body. Unfortunately, in this large study, basically only several people had a near-death experience, and they weren't actually in that group having their EEG being measured. But among those that had cardiac arrest that did have an EEG being measured, unfortunately, none of them had a near-death experience. So it wasn't really conclusionary, but you did know that, again, like we knew from prior research, once you have a cardiac arrest, your measured brain cortical electrical activity is either flat or so disorganized that it should be absolutely impossible to have any lucid organized experience.
What is this?
Absolutely medically inexplicable for that to be due to physical brain function. I think that's like the main takeaway there. And that AWARE-2 study that he mentioned, I won't get into all the details of it because it's kind of hard to explain. But if you're just interested in this kind of stuff, you can just Google AWARE-2 NDE and read about this like kind of fascinating study they did. But okay, here we go. Next video, we're going to jump to Tim Ferriss. I'm sure you probably know who that is, one of the OG podcasters, huge following, and he's interviewing Dr. Bruce Grayson. And Dr. Grayson is probably the most well-respected NDE researcher alive today. He spent 50 years at the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies, which we mentioned earlier, and he has revolutionized the field of NDE research. He came up with the Grayson 16-point scale, the NDE scale. This is this self-report questionnaire, which has become the standard in NDE research. So he's certainly a guy worth listening to. So we'll jump in here and we will start with what is effectively Dr. Grayson's origin story with this. And like many of the greats across all fields, Dr. Grayson's origin story is a fascinating one.
I went through college and medical school with this strict materialistic mindset that the physical world is all there is. And in one of my first weeks as a psychiatric intern, I was asked to see a patient who was in the emergency room with an apparent overdose. I was in the cafeteria having my dinner when this call came through. And being a green intern, I was startled by the beeper going off. And I dropped my fork and spilled some spaghetti sauce on my tie. So again, being a new intern, I didn't want to embarrass myself. So I put on a white lab coat and buttoned it up so nobody could see it. So I went down to see the patient, and she was totally unconscious. I could not revive her. But there was her roommate who had brought her in, who was in another room about 50 yards down the hall. So I left the patient. There was a sitter there with her, as happens with all suicidal patients. And I went down to see the roommate. I spent about 20 minutes talking with the roommate, trying to understand what was going on with the patient, what stresses did she have, what drugs she might have taken for an overdose, and so forth. It was a very hot Virginia late summer night, and I was starting to sweat in that room. There's no air conditioning back in the 70s. So I unbuttoned my coat so I wouldn't sweat so much, inadvertently exposing the stain on my tie. When I finished talking to the roommate, I stood up to leave and then saw that it was open, so I quickly buttoned it up again, said goodbye, and sent her on her way. Then I went back to see the patient, and she was still unconscious. I confirmed with the sitter who was with her that she had not awakened at all during the time I was gone. She was admitted to the intensive care unit because she did have some cardiac instability because of the overdose. And when I saw her the next morning, when she had awakened, she was just barely awake. I went into her room. I said, "So-and-so, I'm Dr. Grayson from psychiatry." And she opened one eye and said, "I know who you are. I remember you from last night." And that just blew me away because I knew she was asleep at best and unconscious at worst. So I don't know how she could have known that. So I said to her, "Yeah, I'm surprised. I thought you were out cold when I saw you last night." Then she opened her eye again and said, "Not in my room. I saw you talking to Susan down the hall." That made no sense to me at all. She was lying there on the gurney. The only way she could have done that is if she had left her body and come down, and that made no sense. You are your body. How can you leave it? So I didn't know what to do. I thought, is she pulling my leg? What's going on here? She saw that I was confused, and then she started telling me about the conversation I had with her roommate, what questions I asked, what Susan's answers were, and then finally said, "And you had a red stain on your tie." That just blew me away. I didn't know what to make of this. I was really getting flustered at this point. I thought, were the nurses somehow colluding with her to trick this poor intern? But no one knew about the stain except the roommate. I realized that, I was having trouble keeping my composure then. But my job was to deal with her mental status, not mine. So I pushed things in the back and just dealt with her about what made you take the overdose, what are you thinking about suicide now, and so forth. And thought, well, I'll think about this other stuff later on. So she was admitted to the psychiatric unit, and I was a busy intern. I didn't have time to think about this stuff. I didn't dare tell anybody. They'd think I was crazy. So I pushed her on the side and just didn't think about it for a while. But it was very, very emotionally upsetting to me to think this bizarre thing happened, but it can't happen. It can't have happened. There must be some other answer to it. It just sat there in the back of my mind for about 5 years until I was now on the faculty at the University of Virginia. And we had a young intern join us, Raymond Moody, who wrote a book called Life After Life, in which he gave us the term near-death experiences and described what they were. I had never heard of this type of thing before. And when he described it to me, I realized that's what this patient was talking about. She was talking about, in a near-death situation, leaving her body, seeing things accurately from another location. And I thought, well, I need to understand this. So I started collecting cases, and it wasn't hard to do. These are very, very common phenomena, but nobody talks about them. But if you start asking patients who have been close to death, they will tell you about them. And here I am 50 years later, still trying to understand them.
Did you?
Yeah. I mean, amazing story. So that experience that Dr. Grayson just described there, that is what is referred to as veridical NDEs. It is its own special subcategory of NDEs. And this subcategory is considered some of the strongest evidence against a materialistic explanation for NDEs. And veridical NDEs are basically somebody has a near-death experience, they come back and they report something that they could not have known that occurred while in this unconscious state. And you can just Google veridical NDEs, or you can type it into YouTube, and there are a list of these things, and it will be, a surgical tool that was, placed somewhere, or something that happened in another room, or something, some action that was done that there's no way the person could have seen this action, but they reported about the action. There's a list of these. And there are, went down this rabbit hole some, and there are, I would say, at least 128 rigorously examined and independently confirmed cases of veridical NDEs. And this is just a big deal, this body of evidence to me. Okay, so next we're going to listen to Dr. Grayson describe the creation of his NDE scale and the components of that scale, which, as I mentioned, this has now become the standard in NDE research.
Let's talk about the scale first, because I'm sure a lot of people listening would think to themselves, well, number one, there have to be a lot of people who just make up stories, and they want to sell books, and they do this, and this. Not in your case. I'm just saying those who've experienced or claim to have experienced NDEs and seen X, Y, or Z. And then there are people who would love to misrepresent and become a messiah of this, that, and the other thing. So how do you make sure you're not fooling yourself or being fooled? Could you just perhaps describe the NDE scale or speak to that whatever way makes sense to you?
Well, back in the late 1970s, after people had read Raymond Moody's book, several psychologists and physicians started getting interested in studying this phenomenon. So we assembled a meeting at the University of Virginia with about 24 of these people, researchers who wanted to study it, and tried to agree on how to do that. And it turned out that everybody had a different idea about what a near-death experience was.
Makes it tricky.
Depending on their background, some thought it was an out-of-body experience. Some thought it was a feeling of bliss. Some thought it was a communion with God. All sorts of different interpretations people had. And they didn't agree on what should be included as part of a near-death experience. So I surveyed a large number of researchers who had published about this and asked them to give me a list of the most common features you see in a near-death experience. I had some 80 features, which is ridiculous. So I took that list and I gave the list to a bunch of near-death experiencers and said, which ones of these do you think are really important in defining a near-death experience? And they whittled it down a bit. And I took the whittled down list and gave it back to the researchers and said, which ones of these do you think are the really important ones? And they whittled it down again and went back and forth between the researchers and the experiencers until I had a consistent list of 16 features that they all agreed were the important parts of a near-death experience. And they included changes in your thought processes, thinking faster and clearer than ever before, having your past flash before you, strong feelings of emotions, usually joy and bliss, and a sense of being unconditionally loved by a brilliant light. Not always. Sometimes there's fear also. So we developed the scale of these 16 items, and I've used that for the standard of deciding which ones of these phenomena are near-death experiences and which ones are not. And it's been now translated into more than 20 different languages It's been used in thousands of studies around the world. There have been attempts to refine it, to improve it. There are things we know now that I didn't know back then. And people have tried to add things to it. But basically, all the additions don't make much of a difference. You still identify the same experiences being NDEs, with or without them. So that's where it was. That's where the scale came from.
Can you speak to
Yeah, no, I would just say that sounds like a pretty good way to come up with a scale for this sort of thing. That's why I wanted to show it to you. Seems pretty legit, I would say. Okay, next you're going to hear a fascinating story. This story is going to be an example of the other subcategory of NDEs alongside veridical NDEs that provide very strong evidence for a non-materialist explanation of NDEs. So let's hear this story.
Can you tell the story of tell me if this is enough of a cue, the red MGB?
Yeah. Many people in a near-death experience say that they encountered deceased loved ones in the experience. And that can easily be explained as wishful thinking, expectation. You think you're dying and you would love to see your grandmother once more, so she comes to you. And there's no way to prove or disprove that. However, in some cases, the person having the near-death experience encounters someone who had died, but nobody yet knew they had died. So that can't be dismissed as expectation and wishful thinking. This is not a new phenomenon. Pliny the Elder wrote about a case like this in the 1st century AD, but we're hearing about a lot of them now. About 12 years ago, I wrote a paper that had 30 different cases from recent years. Jack was one of those. He had an experience, he was in South Africa back in the 70s, and he was a young technician at that time and had very serious pneumonia, and he really stopped breathing and had to be resuscitated. So he was admitted to the hospital with a severe pneumonia. And he had one nurse who was constantly working with him as his primary nurse, a young, pretty girl about his age. He flirted a lot with her when he could. And one day she told him she's going to be taking a long weekend off, and there'd be other nurses substituting for her. So he wished her well, and she went off. And over the weekend, while she was gone, he had another respiratory arrest where he couldn't breathe. He had to be resuscitated. And during that time, he had a near-death experience. And he told me that he was in this beautiful pastoral scene, and there out of the woods came his nurse, Anita, walking towards him. And he was stunned because he was in this different world. What's she doing there? So he said, what are you doing here? And she said, Jack, you can't stay here with me. I want you to go back, and I want you to find my parents and tell them that I love them very much, and I'm sorry I wrecked the red MGB. He didn't know what to make of that, but she turned around and went back into the woods, and then he woke up later in his hospital bed. Now, he tells me that back in the 70s, there were very few MGBs in South Africa, and he had never seen one. When the first nurse came into his room, he started to tell her about his experience and seeing his nurse, Anita. She got very upset and ran out of the room. It turned out that she had taken the weekend off to celebrate her 21st birthday, and her parents had surprised her with a gift of a red MGB. She got very excited, hopped in the car and took off for a test drive, and crashed into a telephone pole and died instantly, just a few hours before his near-death experience. I don't see any way he could have known or wanted or expected her to have an accident and die. There's certainly no way he could have known how she died, and yet he did. And we've got lots of other cases like this. They're called Peak and Darien cases, based on a book that was published in the 1800s with cases like these, where people encounter deceased individuals who were not known to be dead. Yeah, I don't know how to explain those.
Look, if you're a materialist, you just got to sit with that for a second. These peak in Darien NDEs, like peek around the corner in Darien, Darien, like the name. It's, like you said, named after this book. That is the other subcategory of alongside veridical NDEs that is just some of the strongest evidence out there. And Grayson mentions that he wrote a paper describing 30 of these confirmed peak in Darien NDEs. And it's just like, what is that, right? If you have to ask yourself, what is the most likely explanation for these documented phenomena? And in my opinion, a non-materialist explanation seems to be the most likely. A spiritual explanation seems to be the most likely. Things are just not as they seem. Okay, next we are going to hear hear Dr. Grayson just address some of the common materialist explanations for NDEs.
Rational materialists, skeptics, and that's not meant as a criticism of those people at all, might try to explain this. They might say it is a lack of oxygen or a diminishing amount of oxygen. It might be a cascade of neurotransmitters that are released when A, B, or C happens. It might be the introduction of drugs. I certainly know when I've had surgeries, I've had Versed or God knows what else introduced to my bloodstream. Some very strange things happen.
Right.
Although I haven't experienced the type of thing you're describing when I've been anesthetized. How do you respond to those, or how do you think about those explanations?
I'm sympathetic with them. I started out as a materialist skeptic. After 50 years, I'm still skeptical. I'm no longer a materialist. I think that's kind of a dead end when it comes to explaining near-death experiences and other phenomena like this. When I started out, I assumed, okay, we'll look at things like heart rate, oxygen level, drugs given, and so forth. And each thing we tried to study turned out not to explain anything. For example, the most obvious thing was the lack of oxygen, because no matter how you come close to death, that's the last common denominator. You're going to lose oxygen to the brain. But when you actually study this, what you find is that people who have near-death experiences actually have a higher oxygen concentration than people in similar situations who don't have a near-death experience.
How do we know this, or how do we surmise that?
They don't measure what's going on in the brain, but they measure in the peripheral blood system how much oxygen is flowing through.
Okay, with a pulse oximeter or something like that?
Yes.
In a hospital setting. Okay.
They also can draw blood and measure it more directly than at the pulse ox. But what they find is that when they draw blood from people who are in a near-death situation, those who have a near-death experience have a higher oxygen level than those who don't. So what that means is that lack of oxygen is not causing the experience. In fact, it seems to be inhibiting it in some way. And what that means may be that many people have a near-death experience, but if you're lacking oxygen, you can't remember it later on. And then only if you have good enough oxygen do you remember it later on. So it may be related more to the memory of the experience than the experience itself. Likewise, with people given drugs as they're approaching death, the more drugs you're given, the less likely you are to report a near-death experience later. Now, there are some drugs that can mimic parts of a near-death experience. They're not drugs that are given to dying patients, but things like ketamine, various psychedelic drugs, people are using psilocybin now, and they can produce things that mimic in some ways some features of near-death experiences. They don't produce the whole phenomenon. They don't, for example, reliably have the blissful feelings, and they certainly don't have the accurate out-of-body perceptions that many near-death experiencers have. I should say that Jan Holden at the University of North Texas studied about 100 cases of people who claimed to be out of their bodies and seeing things. And what she found when she sought third-party corroboration was that in 92 of the 100, they were completely accurate. In 6 cases, they were partly accurate and partly inaccurate. Only 1 or 2 were completely wrong. So the vast majority were actually corroborated by other people.
Yeah, so I thought overall that's a pretty balanced take from Dr. Grayson, and he brings up just a couple interesting points. This claim, you hear this a lot, this lack of oxygen claim. And it turns out that the evidence actually points to the opposite of that. And then, also just brings up some of the substances, whether it's anesthesia, whether it's psychedelic drugs, these sorts of things. And we touched on this earlier, but just those do not produce the same sorts of experiences that have come, there's such a big database of NDEs that it's like you have a good sense of what these things are like because there's so much commonality across them. And that's just not what happens when you, take ketamine or something like that, for example. Okay. And then lastly, we're going to wrap up here. We'll hear Dr. Grayson address some pushback and just offer some rebuttals against that pushback. And I think that'll be a good place for us to wrap up here.
The use to describe them are different from culture to culture.
When you're sitting at, say, dinner, or you meet a scientist outside of your field of study who's well-intentioned, they're not coming at you in some type of malicious or cynical way. They're genuinely curious, because I think really good scientists are open-minded, but they also ask for proof, or they look to demonstrate proof or disprove hypotheses. What are some of the, if you had to steel man against a non-materialist explanation for NDEs, are there any, if you had to pick them, sort of compelling ways to interrogate this experience from a materialist perspective?
I myself, as a skeptic, and I tend to doubt everything I think as well as everything else that you think. Mm. So I'm not happy with the lack of evidence we have for some of these things. I'm still looking for it, but I went into this thinking there's going to be a simple physiological explanation. We haven't found it. It's been 50 years and we haven't found any explanation yet. That doesn't mean we won't. Right. So we're still looking. We have some technologies now that can study the brain in ways we didn't have before. We have very sophisticated neuroimaging. We have much better computer algorithms for analyzing EEGs. And we have a wider range of psychedelic drugs to use to try to replicate parts of the experience in some ways. So there's a lot going on in physiological research now that was not available 50 years ago. And we may someday have a physiological answer to explain near-death experiences. But let me give you two cautions. One is that if you find something that is always correlated with a near-death experience, a brain wave activity or a chemical, that doesn't mean it's causing the experience. For example, right now, people are listening to us, and there's electrical activity in parts of their brain that process hearing. It always happens. When they're hearing us, this part of the brain always lights up. That doesn't mean that electrical activity is causing our voices. It's just a reflection of it. So when you find these physiological concomitants of a near-death experience, you're finding perhaps the mechanism for it, but not the cause of it. The second caution was that even though I'm a skeptic and part of me still wishes we could find a physiological explanation, I'm still looking. You need to remember that this is what has been called promissory materialism. We don't have the answer yet, but we will someday. That's a perfectly fine philosophical position. It is not a scientific position because it can never be disproven. You can always say, well, we haven't got it yet, but we'll get it in 50 years. We'll get it in 100 years. Tomorrow. So you can never disprove it. So it's not scientific. So saying that that's a scientific way of dealing with things, promissory materialism, is not the way to go. We need to deal with what we have right now and how we interpret what we have right now. And I think most people who study near-death experiences, whether they're spiritualists or materialists or neurophysiologists or philosophers, they agree on the phenomena. They don't agree on the interpretation of it, of what's causing it and what its ultimate meaning is. And I think that's fine. That's not where I am. I'm not a philosopher. I'm not interested in the ultimate cause or the meaning of it. I'm actually a clinician. So what interests me most about near-death experiences is how they affect people's lives and what people do with the experience. And that's the same regardless of what's causing it. Whether it's a hallucination or a spiritual experience, it affects people in the same way. And that's, I think, what interests me most.
So,
Yeah. I mean, promissory materialism, a reasonable philosophical position. It is not a scientific position. And then the other thing he said that really stuck with me is there's agreement on the phenomena. There's not agreement on the interpretation of the phenomena. Okay, yeah, we can leave it here for today. Like I said, there is a wealth of information available online on YouTube about near-death experiences. And the sources of this information are not, some fringe tinfoil hat kook kind of guy. In many cases, the sources are reputable doctors like Dr. Grayson and Dr. Long and others running legit, scientifically rigorous studies that span thousands of well-documented cases spread out across decades and across the globe. The phenomena of NDEs is real. We can argue about the underlying causes and whether those causes are materialist or spiritual. But for me, especially with veridical NDEs and with Pekindarian NDEs, the materialist explanations, they all seem to have real holes in addressing why these things happen. And I think those holes are unignorable. And when I look at the body of evidence that's currently available, a spiritual, non-materialist explanation, that's what makes most sense to me. That may not always be true in the future as new information becomes available, but it's true now. And, we don't all want to be promissory materialists, right? So, this non-materialist explanation for NDEs, it dovetails into other topics that we've touched on here before in Things Hidden. Things are not as they seem. There's a reason why I called this thing Things Hidden. Time being a mirage, or quantum mechanics, or bereavement visions. And then you just have this unavoidable fact that for 99% of the history of humanity, a belief in a spiritual afterlife was ubiquitous. It was a foundational part of every single culture over every single time period ever, going as far back as we have for any evidence of any culture at all. This has been with humanity. This belief in a spiritual afterlife has always been with us. And the weird thing, the rare thing, the brand new thing is to think that that belief is somehow incorrect and that there is nothing spiritual that continues on after our bodily death. That is the real outlier when you look at the history of humanity. Okay, that's it. If you like this, hit like and subscribe. If you want to sign up for the blog, it's in the description. And if you're looking for the online community, it's coming soon. If you know someone that would be interested in Things Hidden, send this to them. I really appreciate your time, and I wish you the best.